But before we begin our Bible study, we're going to allow a few moments of silent time where you can pray and represent yourself before the throne of grace. Time to use the rebound technique if needed. 1 John 1:9, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us and cleanse us of all unrighteousness. Let's bow our heads together for a few moments. I'll finish us out in a group prayer. Our Father God in heaven, we thank you for this time that you've given us to come together and study your word. We pray you go forward with us tonight, make it a source of encouragement and also challenge. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. St. Patrick. Many believe he was Irish, which is in fact not so. And so the biggest flaw in a lot of people's thinking is that St. Patrick was an Irishman. In fact, we're going to look at his history here. There are many legends and stories of St. Patrick, but this is the story. Patrick was born around 385 in Scotland. He was Scottish. Probably Kilpatrick. His parents were Calpurnius and Conchessa, who were Romans living in Britain in charge of the colonies. As a boy of 14 or so, he was captured during a raiding party and taken to Ireland as a slave to herd and tend sheep. Ireland at this time was a land of Druids and pagans. He learned the language and practices of the people who held him. By the way, they were hedonistic and demon worshippers. During his captivity, he turned to God in prayer. At one time he wrote, "The love of God and his fear grew in me more and more, as did the faith, and my soul was roused, so that in a single day I have said as many as 100 prayers in the night, and in the night nearly the same. I prayed in the woods and on the mountain. Even before dawn, I felt no hurt from the snow or ice or rain." You'll find out many times throughout history that God uses intense or even cruel conditions to prepare believers for service. Patrick's captivity lasted until he was 20. So from 14 to 20. When he escaped after having a dream from God in which he was told to leave Ireland by going to the coast. There he found some sailors who took him back to Britain, where he reunited with his family. He had another dream in which the people of Ireland were calling out to him, "We beg you, holy youth, to come and walk among us once more." He began his studies for the priesthood. He was ordained by Saint Germanus, the Bishop of Auxerre, whom he had studied under for years. So you have to see here that the preparation was kind of like Moses, 40 and 40 before he got to the last 40, and the preparation of this young man. Later, Patrick was ordained a bishop and was sent to take the gospel to Ireland. He arrived in Ireland March 25, 433, and so that must be why St. Patrick Day is in March. Not sure. One legend says that he met a chieftain of one of the tribes who tried to kill Patrick. Patrick converted Dishu, the chieftain, after he was unable to move his arm until he became friendly to Patrick. Patrick began preaching the gospel throughout Ireland, converting many. He and his disciples preached and converted thousands and began building churches all over the country. Kings, their families, and entire kingdoms converted to Christianity when hearing Patrick's message. Patrick by now had many disciples, among them Benigus, Auxilius, Isserninus, and Fiac, all later canonized as well. Patrick preached and converted all of Ireland for 40 years. He worked many miracles and wrote of his love for God in Confessions. After years of living in poverty and traveling and enduring much suffering, he died March 17, 461. That's probably actually the reason they celebrate St. Patrick's Day. He died at Saul, where he had built the first church. Why a shamrock? Patrick used the shamrock to explain the Trinity and has been associated with him and the Irish since that time. St. Paddy was a Scotsman. Now you have to endure all the stupid people who believe he's Irish, see? Okay. We're going to start a new study. It's going to start off in 1 Samuel chapter 30. If you want to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, you don't go out drinking. You go out and evangelize somebody. Thank you. First Samuel chapter 30. This chapter will introduce our next subject. At this time in history, David is not yet king. In fact, he has had to leave Israel because Saul was persecuting him. And Saul was going crazy at the time, by the way, from reversionism. And David had escaped, and he was actually living. He escaped to the Philistines, which is typically the enemy. And they liked David so much that they gave him a city. And the name of the city was Ziklag. And there's where David and his warriors stayed, and their families, and even some warriors from the Judean countryside had joined David's warriors, and he kind of had an army, if you will, that headquartered in the city of Ziklag, and they would go out on raids and attack the enemy from there. So that's where we start the story. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 1. Now it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag, they had been gone out making war, on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south, and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag, and burned it with fire. One point you'll find out in history, and we found especially in the Civil War here, is that when you left home to go fight in the war, what happened to the home place? It got raided, and the women and children a lot of times were abused while the husband was gone. And so the first thing you need to know about warfare is that women and children suffer the most in warfare. Women and children do. And that's exactly what happened here. Verse 2, and had taken captive the women and those who were there, from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way. So they burned the entire city, and they took the women and children, and obviously the animals, all of the wine and the liquor, if you will, and they had left. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire. And their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives, Ahinoam and the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him. He was in fact the leader of this city. Because of the soul of the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in who? In the Lord, his God. And so you need to recognize that even your best friends can turn on you, and you need a friend that will stick closer than a brother, and that is Jesus Christ. And David knew who to lean upon in time of crisis. Then David said to Abiathar, the priest, Ahimelech's son, please bring me the ephod here to me. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. Now David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail to recover all. Now, here's something you need to recognize. God didn't protect the city. The Amalekites came and they pillaged, they burned, and they stole. God didn't go out and strike the Amalekites down. He told David to do it. So David prays, and God answers his prayer, and David must take action. So here's what you need to know. You are supposed to take care of what you can take care of. God's not going to do it for you. It's just like when he let Peter out of prison. Peter had to dress himself, and he had to walk himself out of the prison. God opened the gates. Peter didn't have the key to the gate. God opened the gate for him, and he said, get dressed and walk out. Same thing here. God is not going to do for you what he requires that you do for yourself. Verse 9, so David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those stayed who were left behind. But David pursued, and he and 400 men, for 200 stayed behind, who were so weary that they could not cross the brook Besor. Now there's a fact of history. And the fact of history is that you are in a human body. And your human body will do what you ask of it. And there were 200 of these men who did not have the conditioning in their human bodies to go and deliver their own families. They did not have the physical conditioning to do it. So they had to stop. And when you start talking about this kind of conditioning, it comes over a period of time. And the preparation takes years to be able to do this kind of work. Because it's the endurance fibers that you have to build into your muscles. And I've done some of these things where you go 20 and 30 plus miles through the mountains, and you just can't roll out of the bed one day and just do it. It takes a lot of building up and a lot of conditioning. And so a fact of human history is that men, God has given testosterone to preserve and protect women and children. God gave man muscle. He gave man muscle. And he is supposed to condition his human body so that in times of distress, when he's called upon, he can in fact go into action, and he may be even required to do as these 400 men did here in the time of crisis. Regretfully, many of our men now sit behind computers and eat a lot of cheeseburgers. And my generation is the worst, because we were the only ones who lived through the Cold War. We were the last generation who thought the Russians were coming across the Siberian Peninsula. And we just knew they were going to drive their tanks across the ice and invade Alaska and come right down the west coast and take America. And we were expecting them at any time. See, the threat of communism. And we said, the Russians are coming. And everybody drew cartoons. The Russians are coming. But, see, we lived under the threat of communist invasion. And we knew it meant we'd lose our freedom. But now, my generation are all under cardiac distress. And their vessels are being plugged up with cholesterol. And though they may still believe that the communists are coming, and it may be the Chi-Coms now, or any combination thereof of North Korea and Russia, they can do nothing about it. And they will not even make it to the brook of Kidron. They won't make it that far. They can't make it out of the Lazy Boy. You see? And they may be able to say that I told you they were coming, but they can't do anything about it. See, all tactics, whether individual or group, require movement. So they kept going, 400 of them. Then they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David. And they gave him bread, and he ate. Now, this was the enemy. And they let him drink water. And they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his strength came back to him, for he had eaten no bread or drunk no water for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, there's a lesson in this. You don't always torture people to get answers. And they recognized that this man was about to die of being deprived. And they said, look, we'll treat him as a friend, and he'll do what we want him to do, because he has seen that we mean him no harm. Verse 13. Then David said to him, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? And he said, I am a young man from Egypt, servant of an Amalekite. My master left me behind because 3 days ago I fell sick. We made an invasion of the southern area of the Chetherites, the territory which belongs to Judah, and the southern area of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. Now, you know these guys wanted to kill him now. He's saying, I burned your city. And David said to him, can you take me down to this troop? So he said, "Swear to me by God that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to their camp." When he had brought him down, there they were, spread out all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing. See, this same thing happened in Abraham's day. Remember when Lot got captured? Guess what the troops were doing? They were drinking liquor. They got. And guess what? The same thing happened here. Now they're drinking all the fine wine they found in Ziklag. And guess who shows up baring teeth like a bulldog? And the enemy is unprepared. See, they're stumbling around trying to find their equipment. They're eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil which they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. Then David attacked them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Now, you want to talk about endurance. These guys have just marched where others had to stop, and now they are going to battle, hand-to-hand combat, for a whole day. Not a man of them escaped. And so the issue of warfare is to kill the enemy until there is either no enemy left or they quit. Except for 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So David recovered all the Amalekites that carried away. David rescued his 2 wives. And nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. Then David took all the flocks and herds they had driven before, those other livestock, and said, "This is David's spoil." So, interestingly, not only did they recover their families, which was the most important aspect, they recovered their flocks, but they also recovered the animals that had been plundered from other villages, and the spoils from other places were all in this one camp. So it as were, God gathered all of these things up for David for him to come and collect them. Turn the air conditioner off for us. Verse 21, we're going to see a super grace attitude here in the next section. Now David came to the 200 men who had been weary, that they could not follow David, whom they had also made to stay at the brook of Besor. So they went out to meet David and meet the people who were with him, and when David came near the people, he greeted them. In other words, he had their families. And these 200 men who couldn't go on, he's brought their wives and he's brought their children, and they were reunited. Then all the wicked and worthless men of those who went with David, now they had conditioning, but they didn't have integrity. Okay? Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except for the man's wife and children, that they may lead them away and depart. But David said, "My brethren, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us. Who has preserved us and delivered us into the hand, the troop that came against us?" In other words, our victory was of grace, just like God's grace. "For who will heed you in this manner? But as his part goes down to the battle, so shall his part be who stays by the supplies. They shall share alike." In other words, we're dividing it evenly among everyone, and even the ones who couldn't go into battle are going to get their part. So it was from that day forward, he made a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. And so the statute was the spoil of war gets broken down incrementally to everyone. See, that's grace. Now when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, "Here's a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." To those who were in Bethel, and to those who were in Ramoth in the south, and those who were in Jeter. And so it goes through and it tells about how he divided all the spoils of war. And in verse 31, those who were in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men were accused to rove, accustomed to rove. And so these were the towns that he would visit when they were out on the warpath, if you will. And he said, look, we're going to spread this spoil around, and we're going to use the grace method. They didn't earn it or deserve it. It is a gift from God. And so what we see is that the super grace believer is prepared for crisis. He's prepared for crisis. And while some men may be prepared in their bodies, and they may be visible heroes, only some are invisible heroes. And so we're going to see the crisis personality. I didn't want that. I wanted this one. Can you see my PowerPoint? Okay. Crisis personality. We're going to see two flavors of crisis personality. So the introduction to this, and obviously in the Bible there are a tremendous number of crisis personalities, but also in history. In history, there are crisis personalities. So first of all, we're going to see the visible. I'm going to call him the visible because you know the invisible hero. You know who he is. The visible crisis personality is a member of society having been prepared in personality, experience, or both, appears at the time of crisis to form or fill leadership in thinking, saying, or doing. So this might be someone like the President of the United States. He might not even be a Christian, but he's been prepared. His personality is the leadership type of personality. He may have the experience, he may have both. And then the second flavor of crisis personality we're going to talk about in the church age, a member of the royal family, prepared through the accumulation of Bible doctrine and resultant momentum, appears at the time of crisis to lead in right thinking, right saying, and right doing. See, this is the invisible hero, if you will. Now, it just so happens that some believers may be both. They may be a visible hero in their own time of crisis, and they may actually be a super grace hero as well. Not often. St. Patrick is one of them. The crisis is that the Irish are dying in hedonism and going to hell. And so he takes the gospel and he evangelizes the whole nation. All right, so point one. The key to the crisis personality is abnormal pressure and unusual circumstances. Abnormal circumstances generally come from historical disaster. And we are on the brink of a famine in the United States of America. The famine in the Bible, while it may have been a drought or locust or whatever the case, it was always an agricultural disaster because they lived mostly under agrarian economies. So the word famine can still be used, but forget about the grasshoppers and the drought. Think about economic collapse. And I'm sorry, your country can only have so many disasters before it cannot financially recover. You can't just be plagued with earthquakes and tornadoes and wildfires and viruses. You can't just march through that with no effect. And so we're right on the brink of destruction. And no one wants to talk about it. It's a hard subject. We may just have our own disaster to come to the forefront in. Point two, the crisis personality, either through thought, speech, action, or a combination thereof, leads and dominates in disaster. And wasn't it a funny deal that common sense is what preserved a lot of people in the ice storm? And do you know what one of the side effects of super grace status is? Common sense. I heard, there was a man who put his family in the car in the garage and started it up to run the heater to get his family warm, and they all died from carbon monoxide poisoning. So one of the side effects of growing to super grace status is that you accumulate enough wisdom, even worldly wisdom, to have common sense. And it may just be that you get to teach somebody how to catch a crawdad in a ditch. So you can have you some crawfish soup, which, by the way, the Indians used for the explorers to cure dysentery. Common sense. It's a characteristic that is quickly fading. Point three, there are ways in which a crisis personality can meet disaster. 3 ways. Through thought, through speech, and or action. Therefore, the crisis personality, through these 3 systems, dominates in disaster, so that people involved in the disaster are delivered, encouraged, changed, or in some other way profited from the disaster. Now, we just read a story where David was the perfect leader. Not only was he the visible leader of the community, but he was a super grace believer. And where was the first place he sought answers from? From the Lord. That's all he cared about. He wanted to know, what did God want him to do? And once he received the directions, he executed orders. He had no problem immediately and swiftly doing what God said to do. One of the things that you need to remember, though, is what about these women and children that were taken and they were kidnapped? All walking together as captives. Do you not know that some of these women would have broken down and they would have been crushed mentally because they could not handle that type of pressure in crisis? But in the midst of these women would have been some super grace believers that would have said, calm yourself, child, before God will deliver us. You wait and see. You trust Him and you be calm. And whether we live or whether we die, God will deliver us. And could you imagine what these women would have quietly thought to themselves when they heard David and his army come into the camp and start slicing throats? I told you to be calm and trust in God. You see, there's always a crisis personality and someone who is looking to God for deliverance, while others fall to pieces through thinking, through saying, through doing. Point 4, the prophet is not always victory, but at least some form of blessing at that time or at a later time. So the prophet may be in preparation. God may be delivering you from this one situation and preparing you for another. And while we may not be able to keep our country. And we may in fact be headed in a third world status, not worthy of mention in biblical prophecy. The next step may be that. That doesn't mean that you can't have fun. See, you were prepared for hard times through Bible doctrine. And therefore you can enjoy every aspect of life, no matter what life throws at you, no matter what phase of a historical trend you find yourself in, you can laugh in the face of disaster. You see, that's the super grace believer. God has prepared his soul through Bible doctrine so that he can enjoy any and every phase of life that can come. Point 5, a visible crisis personality may be a good or bad person. See, this were the unvirtuous soldiers that were with David. They were a visible personality, a visible crisis personality, because they were not only trained in combat, but they had the type of endurance needed to not only march, but spend over 12 hours in battle, subduing the enemy. He may be pleasant or obnoxious, attractive or unattractive, but he is always controversial. This will be like your General Patton types. He had a large mouth, but he was a great leader. The crisis personality emerges as the man of the hour in the greatest historical disaster. Example, Winston Churchill. He was one of the few leaders in Europe that said we need to fight. We're not going to lay down and be slaves. I'd rather die. Point 6, the crisis of personality has the ability to think under pressure, which is the definition of courage. Crisis personality may be even a great public speaker whose message in historical disaster turns the tide. Example, Booker T. Washington, Patrick Henry, or Martin Luther, whose message of salvation by faith instead of works, nailed on the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, started the Reformation. Point 7, often but not always, the visible crisis personality does not appear to adjust to normal times and normal circumstances, like the hero who cannot adjust to the routine of garrison duty or civilian life. You see, this is where the super grace believer differs. He does just fine in any circumstance, whether it's a time of quiet and peace and hardly any application, or whether they're standing on the brink of destruction. The visible crisis personality, therefore, could be a national hero, but he is not a hero with God. Point 8, generally speaking, the visible crisis personality possesses great honor, integrity, and realizes the peak of his expression under disaster circumstances. Once the crisis is past, the crisis personality is all too often forgotten. Ecclesiastes 9:14 and 15. And you could say that when David delivered the women and children, I'm sure many of them went home and they forgot David. They were just about to stone him before. He got the job done. They went back home and they probably didn't ever even think about it. So point 9, there was a veteran of the Marlborough Wars once wrote the following: God and the soldier we adore, in time of danger, not before. The danger past and all things sighted, God is forgotten and the soldier slighted. See, the peril at the gates is what make people think of God and our national heroes, military. So point 10, in time of disaster, people follow the leadership of the crisis personality. But once the disaster is over, The same people are often embarrassed by their bad decisions, which first created the disaster. Therefore, they blot out the embarrassment of their own failure, and simultaneously they blot out their hero. Since they had to forget about the past and their stupid decisions, they also forget about the deliverance. And what a great time in history to relive and rethink about all of the men and women who died and fought for our freedom and provide the very freedom that we are enjoying today. The United States of America. And if we stopped in every grade of school and we began teaching nothing but national history, the value of freedom, and the cost of freedom, and the preservation of freedom, we could in fact raise another generation who might actually make it through the communist onslaught who is in the country. But what are we doing? We're making our police look like the enemy on the street, and our military look like they're some sort of group out here persecuting the world. Therefore, we blot out the hero. Now, I've often thought of going into the public school and asking for permission to come in and teach. The problem is I'd be cast out immediately because you're entering the lair of the dragon, if you will. The biggest mistake we ever made in America was letting the government educate our children. It should have stayed in the churches, and it should have been independent. Well, in the last section, we have the super grace believer, the crisis personality. What, in fact, is the crisis personality in the church age? And I can't finish this last section, so I think what I'll do is give you point one, and then we're going to come back. If God be willing, we'll come back. What is the crisis personality in the church age? It is, in fact, the believer with momentum inside the divine dynasphere. How do you get momentum? You shovel coal in the fire. See, your mama never read you the story of I think I can, I think I can. And the little train had to go up the mountain. But he had to develop momentum. It was momentum in his thinking. He had to be fed the right thoughts. The believer who shovels the coal of Bible doctrine into his soul develops momentum that can power him through any adversity life has to offer. You see, it's the power of thinking. He is prepared by continued momentum. And while we have the opportunity to attend Bible class right now and shovel coal into the fire, it may not always exist. And therefore, for a believer, a super grace believer, to be a crisis personality, he has to develop momentum before the crisis. Otherwise, he fails in time of disaster. And so we see we've got a lot of problems in the United States of America. We're making bad policies right now, but not only that, the disasters that only God can provide are coming to our doorstep in waves. And it doesn't matter what kind of leadership you have, you can't stop hurricanes. Leadership can't stop hurricanes. Leadership can't stop pandemics. Leadership can't stop wildfires, earthquakes, and other disasters. They cannot. See, Jesus Christ controls history, and He makes sure that you understand that from time to time and gives some things that no man can control. And therefore, what are we left to do? We are left here with the most valuable asset man has ever known, and that is in fact, Bible doctrine in the soul. And the truth that can carry the believer through any aspect of life, and he can in fact enjoy it. Okay, I want to thank you for your attention and attendance this evening.